Hey everyone. This video is going to go over the second essay that you had to read for week 7, assignment 1, the sample essays on arguing crisis. And the second essay was The Pack Rat Among Us. I thoroughly enjoyed this essay. I don't know if you guys did, but I found it super intriguing and uh, pretty successful. Um, Anyway, so you were asked to answer some questions about it, and question 1 asked, what is the most important appeal in this argument? And what passage best illustrates that appeal? Well, I think that answer is subjective in a certain sense because I think she does use several different types of appeals throughout the essay. So if you are more drawn to logic, that type of appeal, then you may have been drawn more to like paragraphs 6 through 14, right? And this is where she gives her explanation, her line of reasoning for why hoarders hoard. So she's getting into the psychology of it, and she's using some sources to help explain how a seemingly typical person goes from simply keeping, or storing keepsakes, memorabilia, to full blown hoarding. And that could have been super convincing for someone who is very drawn to logic. So perhaps you would say that's the most important appeal that she used in the essay. If you were looking for, more of an ethos appeal, to credibility, I think that her personal experience with hoarding, which is the first few paragraphs of the essay, are super interesting and really draw you in and make her, I think they make her a convincing speaker, because she has such close personal experience with this problem. And then her use of sources is pretty convincing as well. So if you're more convinced with credibility, then those might be the most important appeals that she uses. I think the appeal that is used most throughout the essay is pathos. And certainly, we've learned that, especially with advertising and propaganda, that pathos can be supremely convincing. Perhaps even to the point where we become so overwhelmed with our emotional response to something that we block out the contradicting logic that's there. And I don't think she crosses that line. I think she stays within an ethical boundary, but I think that the essay is very rife with pathos. Her opening description of the house on the hill, paragraphs 1 through 5. I mean, gosh, if that's not an emotional appeal, I'm not sure what is. That description is very vivid. Then she also, even in the middle, when she's using logic to explain the reasons why hoarders hoard, there's still an appeal to pathos happening, which I don't know that I see very often, the two working together, at least not as obviously as I spotted it in this essay, because she is being very logical in her line of reasoning, explaining how people go from simply storing some keepsakes to being full-blown hoarders. And it seems very logical as I'm reading it, but at the same time, she's incorporating these other appeals that kind of deepen our understanding of it or our reaction to it. So in paragraphs 6 through 14, our need to save and store things just in case. An appeal to our basic needs. Like, we need to be prepared to survive. She hits on our fear of going without, of not having what we need, of not having enough. Again, so appealing to our basic needs there. Our fear of, our desire to keep memories preserved, right? And a very much an emotional appeal right there. We all, for the most part, understand that emotional connection that we have to objects. Um, our desire to feel safe and like we belong. She goes into that part where hoarders end up isolating themselves because that's where they feel safest. And I think that that's something that we can relate to on an emotional level as well. Maybe not their choice of escape. We might not understand why being in a house that is a hoarding house would make you feel safe, but we understand the need to feel safe, to be in a location where we feel like we belong, and that we will escape places where we don't feel like we belong. And then she also talks about how hoarders are some of the most creative and inventive people. How they're always taking on projects, and they have these fabulous ideas and these dreams of what they're going to do with all of the stuff that they're collecting. And it kind of hits on our value, how we value creativity, how we value resourcefulness, right? So as she's giving us this logic, explaining the psychology behind it, she is also inserting these very subtle appeals to make us connect to the hoarder a little more. Because at first glance, she knows not many of us are going to understand how or why hoarding happens. But if she's able to make those appeals as she's explaining it, then we start to understand a little more. We start to connect a little more. And then from paragraph 15 down to the end, that's when she starts to get into advertising and consumerism. And so she gets us right into the middle of the psychology behind hoarding, and then she pulls us back and widens the scope a little bit and brings in other elements, cultural elements that feed into the psychology. But they are elements that even non-hoarders are affected by, right? Our desire to fit in, how advertising gets us. Our desire to have the latest and greatest stuff, right? Especially like electronics, but pretty much anything. So that appeal is very strong in the end as well. So I don't know how to answer. I don't know if there is a one correct answer to the question, because I think to say what is the most important appeal, if you're looking at an argument, the success of an argument is if it was convincing enough, right? So I think that depends upon the reader. What do you find most convincing? So perhaps for you, it was the logic, right? Perhaps it was the ethos. Perhaps it was the pathos, and certainly the pathos is what I found to be most abundantly used throughout the essay. And in ways that I thought were very subtle and very inventive, and for me personally, pretty effective. So she uses it in ways that I was not expecting. So question number 2 says, talks about how she doesn't, this is an argument of crisis. And she really does not offer any kind of solution. She gives, she mentions some personal goals of hers, but she really doesn't offer any kind of solution to the crisis. So the question is, why doesn't she? What would be the reason why she doesn't offer any kind of solution? And I think that right now she is really trying to just convince people that it is a crisis, something that the rest of us need to pay attention to, and not just, push it over to the side and say, well, that's just a small percentage of the population. I wouldn't necessarily call it a crisis. Most of us don't suffer from the hoarding or the effects of hoarding. So she has to get us to see that it very well could be something that affects more people. And then, you know, I think there's also this point where she's trying to, the point she's trying to make that, hoarders are kind of like freak show oddities still to a lot of us in America. We'd rather gawk at them. Think about the TV shows. I mean, there is a TV show called Hoarders, and they've become a form of entertainment, right? So we'd much rather be astounded by it. We'd much rather react to the sensationalism of it than to think about the actual problem and how to help people. So I think those are the reasons why she doesn't really offer a solution. Be interested to see what you guys thought about that question. Question 3 says that she blurs the lines between hoarding and consumers, right? So how does this affect the argument, and how did it affect you as you read? I thought it was pretty brilliant myself. She blurs that line first to create common ground between hoarders and the readers. If we see the common ground, how all of us have these tendencies that perhaps we're simply able to keep under control, but they're there. If she can get us to see that common ground, then maybe we will empathize more and admit it is a crisis. And then we'll start advocating for more help and more solutions. And then we can get into the solution part of a crisis argument. I think it makes us, if you really are open to what she's pointing out about consumerism, it makes us take a closer look at our roles as consumers and savers, and how our society creates the perfect breeding ground for hoarding to take over in a person's life. It's probably really easy to cross that line into hoarding. Probably a lot easier than most of us realize at first. But there's nothing stopping us. It's all at our fingertips, and even more so today. I mean, having stuff delivered right to your doorstep. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the numbers for hoarding shoot up, and especially if you consider all of the added stress that the stress that we're adding to our lives year after year. Life just seems to get harder and harder, faster and faster. And if you think of hoarding as some sort of defense mechanism, some sort of coping mechanism, it'd be easy to see how life today would prompt, just like drug use. It's a different kind of reaction to the stress of life. And on top of that, everything is so accessible now. You can just keep collecting and keep collecting and keep collecting, unencumbered practically. So I think that connection to consumerism is there to create that common ground and make us take another look, a deeper look at our culture, our society, and maybe ourselves. The next question is about her use of sources. It said to pick one and describe how it functions in the essay. And there were several to choose from. So obviously your answer might be completely different than mine. I picked the one that stood out to me the most, which was on page 222, where she has gotten into talking about advertising and consumerism. And the quote comes from Daniel Lascarin, the University of Victoria professor, and it was the block quote there at the bottom of page 222 where he says, We live in a culture of consumption. Many of us sacrifice more than half of our lives doing things we don't enjoy to buy things we don't need. We have plenty, yet feel dissatisfied. The only way out is to stop and ask what we really want instead of letting the media and big business tell us. That for me was the most thought provoking source that she used. I thought it was so succinct, so concise in driving home that point. And it's the one that made me stop and think the most. So that's for me, why I chose that one. I think as far as how it functions in her argument, I think it's part of an appeal, because this is where she was getting into our desire to fit in, our desire to have the best and newest stuff. So it's part of that appeal, getting us to see how we fit into the whole issue of hoarding. Could be a counter argument, because she doesn't necessarily mention the opposition specifically at any point throughout the essay. But I mean, if she's trying to get us to see that hoarding is a crisis and that we should all care about hoarding because, we all practically exhibit similar symptoms, just kept more in check than a hoarder. If she's trying to get us to see that, and to see that at any moment, perhaps one of us could cross that line, the scales could tip, and boom, we're starting to amass way more than we intended, and then we can't part with it. And if she could think of what the opposition might say, any of us reading it might say, okay, yeah, some people, go too far and become hoarders, but, not me, like, not the average person out here. We don't need that stuff. We don't feel like we have to have it. And she uses this appeal here as perhaps counter argument to that. Not explicitly. It's very subtle. But to say, oh really? Maybe you need to stop and take a closer look at yourself, because I bet you do have some of these same symptoms. I bet you do exhibit some of these same behaviors. So that could be one way of looking at how she uses the sources within the argument. But again, there were several other instances where she used sources, so you may have picked something completely different. And you may have picked the same one I did and had a completely different reason for choosing it. And that's fine. So the last question says, I thought this one was interesting. What values and assumptions does Schutze share with the other authors that we've read in this section? And I know that this was the second essay out of the 3 you had to read, so you probably hadn't read the third one yet. So it's a little odd that they would ask this question and not have the essays presented in an order that would make more sense. But, they're all assuming that we are all consumers with the same mindset, that this is America. I will do, buy, or build whatever I want because it's my right. They kind of assume that we're going to understand that mentality. They assume that we're willing to take a closer look at ourselves. All 3 authors in the essays that you were assigned to read, they are all trying to point something out about us individually as a country. And they assume that we're willing to take that hard look. Perhaps not all of us are. In terms of values, if you're looking at each essay, I think that there's this value of responsibility and the value of community. And I'm sure there are others, but responsibility and community really stand out to me in all three. And it might seem odd with this one, the pack rat among us. How does responsibility and community play in there? But I think she's trying to say that we all need to be more responsible, um, and that you know we need to help. That these people who fall victim to hoarding, they deserve our empathy and our help, not um, to be treated like circus freaks. Um, so be interested to see what you guys have to say about question number 5 as well. I really thought that this particular essay pointed out some very thought-provoking ideas. I know it really made me stop and think about what I buy, why I buy it, what I keep, why I keep it, and really stretch beyond just the fact that it's easy to buy things and easy to keep things, and really get at the reasons why and if those are problematic in any way. So I hope you guys enjoyed that essay as well. If you have any additional questions or comments about it, feel free to send them my way. Otherwise, you guys can go watch the video on the third essay that you had to read.